Right now, the US is a car driving into a wall with our foot all the way down on the gas. The federal administration is proposing a $7 trillion budget next year. We have $33 trillion of national debt. That number has swelled since COVID and in the years following due to the launch of new programs and other stimulatory effects, spending by the federal government. And the problem with having too high of a national debt relative to national GDP is the way that a government pays their debt is by taxing their economy, taxing their GDP. And there's a natural limit to how much economically you can actually tax the economy. Once you increase taxes too high, investment declines. Once you tax investments too high on individuals, people leave. We saw this with the launch of the wealth tax in France. There's an attrition of capital, a hiding of capital. All of these factors aren't necessarily about people being bad and doing bad things. They're just natural economic forces that we've seen play out many times in the past. So there's a certain natural limit to how much debt government can actually take on.
Do we have a sense of what that limit is?
Some people would argue it's somewhere between 100 and 150, maybe up to 200% of GDP, but 100 and 150% is really where things are sustainable. Now, the US is a very unique outlier in, the history of global economies. But there has been a set of studies, and Ray Dalio kind of captured a bunch of data together in his book about the changing world order and the economic cycles that we've seen historically. 6 times in the last 500 years, we've seen these sorts of things. So I think that's the thing that makes me worried is at some point, spending at the federal level gets so high and debt levels get so high that it's really hard to come back from that money printing that's needed to support paying that interest and paying that debt. And right now, inflation is being fueled by the stimulatory effects of these programs. And because things are inflating, the government feels like there is a need to help make things easier for people. So they put more money and launch more programs to try and reduce inflation. And in doing so, they increase inflation. And then as inflation goes up, the interest rates on the debt have to go up. When the interest rates on the debt go up, it becomes harder to pay down the debt. And so our $33 trillion of debt, a good 50% of it is getting refinanced now, where the interest rate moves from an average of about 3% to 5%. And when that happens, 2% increase in interest on $15 trillion, that's another $300 billion of interest payments a year. And this year, we're already paying $1 trillion just in interest on the debt that the federal government owes to its bondholders, to the people that own treasuries. So we're getting to a point that it becomes really difficult to actually stop the spending, pay the interest, and or reduce the debt levels. And that's how these spirals kind of have played out historically. And every time it's played out, whether it was the Dutch or the English or, whomever you want to kind of look to, there was always this, it can't happen here. This is the leading global economy. This is the reserve currency of the world. It's not going to happen here. And every time the natural forces of arithmetic played out, that's why I'm so worried. I think we are fundamentally driven by this concept that I think is best phrased as desire. It doesn't go away. Humans never stop wanting. The natural condition of a human is to see something that we don't have and then create an objective of, I want to have that thing I don't have. When I then have that thing, I no longer feel like I'm unmotivated. I now look for, and I naturally see the next thing. I think this is what made humans evolutionarily successful. We were able to then scout out the next meal, scout out the bigger building, scout out the better cave, and it allowed us as a species to continuously progress, expand our population, and succeed and thrive on this planet. But the unfortunate reality is that tuning, that biological tuning, has this effect where no one is ever actually fully satisfied with the things they have. Satisfaction comes from the change in the things that you have, the delta. And the delta from year to year is what drives happiness. And in a voting system, in a political system, it drives how people vote. That if my income isn't going up by 10% per year, I am unsatisfied. And there's a lot of good behavioral social studies on this. There was a study done years ago, which I think has been disproven since, but it does a good job, I think, of explaining this, which is up to a certain limit of income, people are unhappy and they get happier with more and more income. After that limit of income, where all of your basic needs are met with respect to being able to pay for your food, your housing, medical, and take care of your family, your income is no longer your predictor of happiness. Your change in income is your predictor of happiness. So if we start with that premise of human behavior, the federal government of the United States now has an incredible role in supporting a lot of people through active programs that pump money into businesses. So the government is a customer of many businesses, or employing many people that end up working directly for the government or under government programs. I tried to pull together all this data a couple months ago, but something north of 30 or 40% of the US working force is touched by the government as a customer of their business, their primary customer of their business, or as the employer of those individuals. So the government has been a big driving force for economic growth in the United States over the last 250 years. But we're now reaching a point where in order to sustain that system, where people have their income and their livelihoods improved year after year because of government intervention and government policy, it's no longer kind of sustainable. A lot of people in the United States are dependent on Social Security and the income that comes from Social Security. That program on its own is forecast to go bankrupt in 2033,
Wow.
independent of a lot of the issues we're dealing with in the debt and spending and the rest of the government. The Medicare program, the costs continue to climb, continue to mount, and a lot of people are dependent on that program for their healthcare needs. Those are two federal programs, a very large percentage of federal spending. How do you get voters, where there are tens of millions of people that are dependent on those programs, to vote to reduce those benefits? They simply won't. And it's why neither Democrats nor Republicans, and I'm not advocating for it at all. I'm not advocating for reducing those programs. I'm just pointing out the simple reality of how a democracy will work in this circumstance, which is those individuals don't want to give up those benefits. They don't want to give up that income. They don't want to give up that medical care. It was promised to them. They invested in those programs for decades. But the government and the way that the system has been set up has now made it, very difficult because we have to take on more debt to support those programs. And then we have a lot of other stimulatory programs, a lot of other systems where the government is the customer of businesses. They are spending money to buy stuff from those businesses. Medicare is a good example. They buy a lot of pharmaceutical drugs. The system is challenged because if I'm the government, what's my incentive to negotiate for a lower price? I can go to Congress and get a bigger budget next year. Everyone in the system is built to make more money for themselves. So next year, I want to have a bigger budget. I want to be able to spend more. I want to grow my organization. No one ever leads an organization and says, I want to shrink this organization. I want to cut it by 50%. That's my goal. Let's shrink the organization that I'm leading. The natural incentive is to grow. So I think that there's a lot of tension in the way that the system has evolved, that both the internal organizations are designed to grow and the voters are not going to give stuff up that they've gotten. And I always think about in my junior high, there was a kid who ran for president, and he said, I'm going to make all the vending machines free. That was his platform. It was so smart. And everyone voted for him. Of course I'm going to vote for the guy that tells me I'm going to get the vending machines are going to be free. I don't have to pay for my chips and soda anymore. That's how people get elected in a democracy. They go to the voters and they say, here's what I'm going to give you. They don't say, here's what I'm going to cut back for the survival of the union over the next 50. That doesn't sell. What sells is I'm going to increase Medicare benefits. I'm going to improve Social Security. I'm going to launch new programs to support your community. I'm going to build stuff. I'm going to create new jobs. Those are the things that voters want to hear. And so there's this demand from the voters for more stuff. So I would argue that the politicians aren't necessarily even the cause of the problem. I think that they're more a symptom of the system that is set up to operate this way. Naturally evolves to this point that the voters every year want more stuff. And if they're not getting more stuff because the economy isn't naturally growing and their incomes aren't growing, they turn and look to the government to solve those problems. And then the government has to grow. Then they put people in place who stand up and say, I'll give you all that stuff. And they're like, okay, great. You're the guy. You're the gal. You go do that. We vote for you. And I think that's why it's so hard to back away from this.
How money printing fits into this?
If you look at the balance sheet of the Fed, the balance of the treasuries that they hold, I think it's about $8 trillion now. The central bank of the United States is the Federal Reserve. The federal government needs money to pay its bills, all the stuff that it's spending money on. And the way that the federal government does that is they tax businesses and citizens, and that tax allows them to pay their bills, but we spend more than we make. So the federal government has to issue bonds. These are promises to pay in the future. And those bonds are bought by people like you and I. It's bought by foreign governments, China, Saudis. A lot of individuals and companies around the world like to hold U.S. Treasury bonds. Right now, Treasury bonds are a great yield. You can get 5% interest by buying U.S. Treasuries, and the federal government guarantees they're going to give it to you. That's the word of the U.S. Treasury, which is historically been considered a risk-free asset. And then they take those Treasuries and they get cash, and then they take that cash and they pay their bills. One of the buyers of treasuries is the central bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, which is overseen by Congress, but is separate, doesn't actually report up to the president. The Federal Reserve has this ability to buy treasuries and issue money, issue cash that they don't have, right? So the Federal Reserve has this ability to print the US dollar. Historically, they've been buyers of treasuries, supporting the market for the federal government to be able to issue debt to pay their bills. And then as more money comes into the system from the Federal Reserve, which is effectively created out of nothing, that money flows its way into the economy. And if you have, for example, 30 trillion US dollars floating around versus 10 trillion US dollars floating around, things are going to inflate because there's more dollars to spend on stuff and the cost of things will naturally go up. That's a super, super duper simplified way of kind of explaining the system. So the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, issues money almost on a loan basis to banks and buys treasuries with the expectation that at some point the US government's going to pay them back. So that's the economic relationship between the central bank and the federal government. And the way that money then finds its way into the system, the federal government can't just print the money, the central bank can, and then those treasuries get held by our central bank, and that money finds its way into the system. So at some point, you can look at the total amount of debt of the federal government and think like any household, how much debt can you afford each month? And at what point are you going to go broke? That's one way to look at it. And another way to look at it is that in order to overcome that, there's going to be a lot of money printing because the Federal Reserve can just buy all those bonds and issue that money. And then that money just finds its way into the system. So there's a question at which point there's too many dollars that get printed.
This is the part that people don't understand.
Yeah.
So there's a magic thing that happens when the money is made up out of thin air, completely fake, untethered to anything. It is literally just entry into a database that they decide to click clack, and now that money technically exists. Why isn't that awesome? We can just make more money, just keep making more money, make the budget bigger every year.
Let's say that you and I have $50 each, and we're the only people with money. And there's a guy over here selling sodas. We know we can buy those sodas now, and he's only got 4 sodas to sell. We really want to buy all the sodas, so we eventually end up paying $25 each for a soda. Okay, there's 4 sodas, $50 each. Suddenly, some guy shows up with another $100. Let's say the other guy shows up with $200. Now he's going to start competing for those sodas. And the guy that's selling those 4 sodas is like, hey guys, suddenly the price is $75 a soda because there's more people that want sodas and there's more cash available. So that's how the price of soda is inflated. That's what happens when there's more money that floods into the system, is that the purchasing power of the existing dollars in the system goes down because there's now more money competing for some number of assets or services that are being sold. So the price of assets and the price of services goes up and the value of the dollars goes down, which means that the value of your savings, the value of the stuff you own goes down. And this is particularly true for the majority of Americans who are not big asset holders, right? They only have more than half of Americans can't pull together $1,000 for an emergency. If the value of dollars go down and their incomes aren't going up, they're deeply hurt by that. People that own a lot of stuff can take their assets and they can buy inflation hedged securities or inflation hedged assets. Like you could go buy timberland, you could buy gold, or you could buy Bitcoin, which a lot of people argue is a great inflation hedge now. Those assets, because they're fixed in supply, they will go up in dollar denominated terms. Wealthy people can handle inflation. The majority of other people cannot. And inflation really hurts the economic growth because now people spend less, they have less money to spend, businesses shrink and things go bankrupt. So inflationary cycles are very damaging to economic cycles.
I'll make a statement. You tell me if you think this is fair. Money printing is legalized theft from the government. They are stealing not your dollars, because you're going to have the same amount of dollars in the bank, but they are knowingly stealing your purchasing power, which is the same, in effect, as just taking money from you.
Yes. What I will change about your statement is I will expand the definition of government to the people that were voted into government by the people that voted. And this is what's so important to understand is we all kind of separate out these elitists and these politicians that are doing bad stuff to us. But the voters in the United States have the ability to change that. They have the ability to see this problem and make a decision about who might be a better candidate to solve this problem for us, instead of being myopic to getting more stuff for themselves individually in the near term, which is an impossible ask, but one that's worth noting. There's a reason that there's a reason that the voters have made that choice. It's not just that there is a bad person who is choosing to print a lot of money and steal our money. I am very much about rethinking the concept of the role of government in our lives and in our economy. That's prime to me, because I do think that anytime the government gets involved in markets, it distorts the market forces that allow things to get better, make things cheaper for people, and make markets grow. Everything goes wrong when governments get involved in markets. There's no scenario I can think of where things are good. But individuals will still rationalize it. The guy who owns the defense contractor is very happy with the government being involved in markets because he gets to make a bunch of money selling the government turbines from his business. And because the government is a cost-plus model on defense contracting, the more he charges, the more money he makes. So he's incentivized to charge more every year. So that model needs to change, right? As an example of the things that can be affected by the voters. I agree with your point. I just think that the voters have a role in this, in a democracy, in addressing the problem. I'll say one more thing, which is worth noting. Go back to the example of the soda guy. The guy only has 4 sodas. But what if he comes up with some newfangled technology, a replicator machine, like from Star Trek, and now he can make 8 sodas or 12 sodas or 20 sodas? His invention of that technology makes the cost of soda less, even as there's more money coming in. There's now more sodas, so we don't need to all compete for fewer sodas. So the productivity, the production of more stuff is good for the economy, and it gets us out of this problem. So when you hear people talk about economic growth or GDP growth, there are two things that drive GDP growth. One is the inflation of stuff, things going up because there's more money coming in. But the other one is improved productivity, technology, making more stuff with less resources. And that has historically made the United States so successful, and for the last 250 years has fueled our economy, fueled the United States' success globally, our innovation, our entrepreneurship. Technology solves this problem if we can get it to move quickly, fast enough. There's another point besides just voting right and fixing this through the voting system, which is enabling more technological innovation and enabling productivity gains to arise from technology. In that sense, we face another critical problem right now, which is a very serious negative view on technology. And I do think that the majority of people don't necessarily think about, if you say the word technology, there's a more negative association with that word than positive. Go back to the 1950s. There were all of these crazy posters about humans will go on rockets to the moon and we're all going to live on star bases on the moon. We're all going to be on monorails and move around the country. And monorails are going to be flying cars. These new materials that we were inventing were going to change everything. We'll be able to put on suits and go underwater and go to our underwater cities. There was this incredible wave of innovation that happened, particularly out of the chemical engineering revolution that happened in the early 20th century and the early industrial revolution and then post-World War II, where we were so optimistic about technology. Then what happened is that we started to get cancer, and there were meltdowns of nuclear facilities, and there was Cold War. So there were these big nuclear bombs sitting over our heads all the time, and we were doing duck and cover from nuclear bomb attack training at school. And I think that the American psyche and the psyche of the West largely, which benefited very much from this progress that arose from technology, got really challenged in terms of adopting and appreciating the upside of technology because there was so much downside. And then we got scared of technology, and then everything became kind of this critical anti-technology association. Everything about what appealed to people starting in the 70s, as represented out of Disneyland and Tomorrowland, was all about technology goes awry, and we have to return everything to a natural, organic state. So there's this great tension, and we see it play out all the time in bioengineering, in gene editing, in AI, in all of these advanced technologies that the United States is leading in and progressing in. But there is so much trepidation and concern and fear that we are potentially missing out on the productivity gains, the boon that would arise from these technologies being more rapidly adopted and solving this big kind of economic crunch that we're running into. So I just wanted to highlight that important point because I think it's really critical for folks to pay attention to. And I'm not saying that the concerns and the risks of nuclear meltdowns and cancer and chemicals, all this stuff is unfounded. What we have a tendency to do is to take one event or one experience and blanket the entire space or the entire industry around that one experience and say, we need to stop all of this because we have no margin for loss. We now have literally dozens of gene therapy treatments that can cure dozens of human diseases, saving millions of lives. But for 7 years, we weren't allowed to make those things progress because we were worried about losing another life. Right. And so there's a challenging thing in a wealthy nation like ours. We worry more about loss than we care about gain. If you go to a small, poor African nation, they are not worried about the downside of putting in a nuclear power plant that would drop the cost of electricity and give everyone abundant power in their homes and clean water. They would say, we'll take that now. Done. Lock it in. But the United States, we don't want to have a nuclear reactor because now the marginal cost of electricity gets reduced by 3 cents a kilowatt hour. So it goes from 15 cents to 12 cents. I'd rather not have a nuclear facility in my backyard. We have the privilege of that in this wealthy nation. So that's the other tension that holds us back from embracing new technologies is our risk aversion. We are more worried about loss than we care about gain in this state of where we are.
So money printing, I think a big part of the problem is that people do not understand it. So you can say it, but they don't understand it. And it's a very counterintuitive thing to say, dear constituent, I'm going to print some money and I'm going to give that money to you. And it's very difficult for people to understand that's bad for you. And it may help in like a really acute moment, like when COVID happens and you need to put stimulus into people's hands just to calm some of the panic and make sure everybody makes it through okay. But even that is a trade-off and you're going to have a problem. And I'll say what the problem is very succinctly. The way that money gets put into the system in that magical moment where the Fed creates money out of thin air is that they're buying the bonds with it. So now if I hold that asset class, I'm going to get that money. And so that money basically just protected me. So their mechanism for getting the new money into the marketplace was to buy the asset that I had to give me my guaranteed return on that money. I'm already going to have to be educated to be doing that. So most people aren't doing that. This starts to create this divide between the haves and the have-nots. Then people, what they don't understand in that moment is that when they print the money, they are socializing that decline in buying power across everybody.
That's right.
poor, wealthy, everybody. But the wealthy just got a bump because they got the money that they put into the bond or the treasury protected, plus they got a return on that money. And they only lose as much as the person who gained nothing from the money printing, but now only loses. And so as they just print, if you're like, oh, I'm getting my Social Security protected, oh, I'm getting this funded or whatever, they think, oh, this is amazing, but they don't realize that those losses are being socialized across everybody. And then the other one, and this is something that I've heard you say really succinctly, is that it also creates an appetite for war. Explain why that's true. Why does money printing lead to more wars?
Yeah. It's not simple, but we've seen it historically over and over and over again, which is as great nations rise, their populations demand more, the government takes on debt, prints more money, gives the population more, and at some point you reach this critical natural state where the economic condition isn't naturally growing. It's not catching up to the cost of the debt to support the programs and things that the population demanded. At any given moment, there is the potential for war. At any given moment, there is someone out there talking smack about the United States, instigating, launching stuff at a base. There's always some instigation. The choice of, do we make a decision now to let Saddam Hussein continue to be the leader of Iraq, or do we make the choice to go in and spend $1 trillion to remove him from his position and go get access to those oil fields, and then put US companies in charge of those oil fields, and then tax those companies to generate revenue, becomes a more interesting choice, a more obvious choice. And I'm not saying that there's a conspiracy theory in why we went to, I think America wanted to do something bad coming out of 9/11. We wanted to do something not bad, we wanted to do something aggressive to respond to 9/11.
Well, we've got contemporary examples with Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine. Like there's unfortunately no shortage of things where this is.
So what are we going to do with war? Historically has driven a lot of shifts in economic productivity. It has driven a lot of growth in aspects of the economy that need to be stimulated. It's not like there's a bunch of guys sitting around in a dark room, Illuminati guys saying, let's go to war and grow the economy. But when things are great, when the government is running a surplus, when people are happy, when voters are happy, when the nation is not divided, the economy is growing and everyone is employed and everyone feels good, the US in that circumstance is probably more inclined to say, you know what, let's not escalate this thing right now. Things are pretty good at home. Can you guys just resolve your differences? Same with Russia, Ukraine. Can you guys please just not escalate? We're not gonna give you a lot of weapons. Go negotiate a settlement. Go figure out how to resolve this thing. We rationalize it now as in pursuit of liberty, in pursuit of democracy. There's always a way for either side to rationalize the decision. But I'm just saying, generally speaking, if people are happy at home, they're not looking for conflict abroad. We are not happy at home. And the economic circumstances are deeply coupled with our unhappiness at home. And so we are more willing to engage in conflict abroad. I think there's a lot of aspects to why this happens. One is it brings people together. We now have a common enemy. There's an external force, this bad guy in Russia, Putin, we gotta go get him. Let's all get behind this idea of destroying Putin. It's great, okay, good, he's the bad guy. Saddam Hussein, he's the bad guy, he's the bad guy, let's go get him. And then we get to spend a bunch of money. It's stimulatory. He said all the money's coming back home. We're spending all this money on Ukraine, but we're actually giving them money to buy weapons from US manufacturers. So that money's coming back home. It's stimulatory. It creates economic growth. It creates revenue. And now the debt is owed back by Ukraine. So we're just taking another balance sheet item, right? We're taking a balance sheet item from the Ukrainians. They're now owing money back to the government. We've given them that resource. So I think there's a bunch of reasons. I think that there's this psychological uncertainty that drives this. Things are not good at home. Well, I can feel in control if I go beat someone up. Right? It's like a bully. I can go feel better about resolving my issues at home if I can go fix a country elsewhere and get new businesses installed there and make money there. That could be good. That sounds like a better thing to do because these problems at home are pretty insurmountable. They're pretty hard to deal with. So I think that's why we've seen this. I don't know if anyone's written a good set of papers on this to go through each of the historical periods where we've seen external conflict arise out of increased money printing and debt, but it always happens. It always happens. When things were great, everyone had this ability to say, let's not go to war. Let's do everything we can to avoid conflict.